Welcome back to Wake Up with Nubian Tigers Talk, a podcast brought to you by a group of Black Princeton alumni. Our podcast explores real issues affecting our Black and Brown communities. My name is Michelle Jacobs, and I'm here with my co-host, Ray Smalls. Okay, Ray, so here we go. The trial happened.
Yeah, well, a so-called impeachment trial.
Right.
Yeah, and they had Mo, Larry, and Curly as the defense attorneys for the president, former president.
Yeah, one of the interesting arguments one of the defense attorneys made was that Trump couldn't have incited the riot because it was already going to happen.
Yeah,
and It's just astounding to me that nobody wanted to know why was it already going to happen and who was responsible for that.
Yes. Could it be possible that he had something to do with the premeditation? Oh, no, not really.
But nonetheless, we all know what the result was. President Trump, the former President Trump, was found not guilty. That's not a surprise.
Okay, but so let me ask you this question. Being the political scientist that you are, and a lawyer. So we had the final tally was 57 to convict, 43 to acquit. And since you need 2/3, 67, they were 10 votes short. Does this actually make a difference historically?
I think it does, Ray, because the fact of the trial itself is the historical importance. I believe everyone knew going in that there was going to be an acquittal. Right? They just didn't have enough votes. They needed 17 Republicans to vote for guilt. And in this environment, we weren't going to get 17, and I don't think anybody thought that there would be 17.
The only way we were going to get 17 is if they have video of him with the gun in his hand.
Right. And maybe not even then, because as he told us years ago, he could kill somebody on Fifth Avenue and he would still be found.
That's right.
Guilty.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think that the record developed during the course of the trial was so very important to show the horror and the dangers of what happens when you allow someone with fascist tendencies who aligns himself with white supremacy to speak in the way he was allowed to speak without any pushback and the dangers that it creates. I mean, you can think back to the Secretary of State from Georgia when he got on the news and said, you have to stop this because someone is going to get killed. Well, 5 people got killed.
Right. 5 people got killed and 2 committed suicide, 2 Capitol Police afterwards.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
So he was a dangerous man. He's no longer president, and we have to be thankful for that. The record has been created, but actually, I don't think it will prevent him or the type of Republicans who support him from supporting him in the future. Some of them will walk away, but some of them won't.
As a lawyer, let me ask you this, though. Were you disappointed the House managers, I should say, did not request, they asked for witnesses, but they settled for a statement from the Republican Beutler, who was privy to the conversation McCarthy had with the former president.
Right. No, if it was me, I would have subpoenaed the telephone records for McCarthy because the person who would bring the telephone records is called a custodian of records. This is a nonpartisan person. Right. It's just going to be someone who says, yes, we checked the records. Here are the records. This was what the records tell us. On such and such a date, between such and such a time, a call went from Mr. McCarthy's phone to the president of the United States or vice versa, right? And to me, that would have been, that's direct evidence that the call happened, as opposed to the senator's representation that she overheard someone say that the call happened. Right.
That would have corroborated her statement.
Right, exactly.
Right.
I also would have liked to have seen, frankly, some testimony from the head of the National Guard, who said in a press conference that he requested permission to give assistance, and that permission was denied.
Denied by the Secretary of the Army, I believe it was.
Right.
Right. And what did you think before we start the show of the argument about the constitutionality, meaning that because he's out of office, we shouldn't be even having an impeachment trial for the former president?
So most of the constitutional law professors believe that argument was not valid.
Yes.
That there is some precedent for an impeachment process that takes place after the person leaves office. Mm-hmm. That has been done historically. It wasn't a president, mm-hmm. but it was someone who was impeached under that process.
Well, I thought the House managers did an excellent job of substantiating that.
Yeah. So, but the Republican lawyers weren't always dealing with reality because their client doesn't deal with reality. Yeah. And that's what it was.
Well, you know what? It's just good to know that science matters again.
Science matters again. Yes, science matters again. They're trying to get vaccines to people.
Yes.
And we're making policy decisions based on what the scientists tell us about disease. So that's a progressive step.
Hallelujah.
Hallelujah. Exactly right. So hopefully we'll see. I know that the Biden team is making some initiatives to get more communities of color into the vaccine pipeline. They've just recently started a program here with the churches in DC mm-hmm. To see if they can't get healthcare professionals to come out to the churches. That vaccines can be distributed there. So I'm hopeful on that, and I'm keeping an eye on it to see how that's going.
Yeah, and I think one of the other initiatives they've got going, they are trying to create mobile units that will go around to underserved communities all around the country, so that because there's been too much of underserved communities having these vaccine stations set up, and then all of a sudden you have to make an appointment online. Well, I mean, let's face it, if you don't have a computer or if you can't afford cable, guess what? And if your cell phone, you can't even pay for that. And if you've been out of work for months or what have you, how the hell are you going to make an appointment?
Right.
So white people are hanging out in New York City. They're hanging out in Harlem and Washington Heights, where they were never there before, getting vaccinated.
Right. And you can have a computer. I have a computer. I have a cell phone, and I'm pretty tech savvy. It took me 2.5 hours over the course of a day to get an appointment. And that was it took a week to get into the portal in order to spend the 2.5 hours in order to get an appointment.
Unbelievable.
Right. And as you know, some of our group members, some of the Nubian Tigers in New Jersey, still don't have access to any kind of appointment process. So, it's unfolding, and we just have to keep our eyes on it and see how that's going to develop.
Right.
So today, Ray, in previous episodes, we have talked about the loss of Black home ownership in last season. But today, we're going to be speaking with Professor Sandra Thompson, and she's going to educate us on an issue known as heirs property and the problems that it creates for Black families trying to retain their family-held land. Dr. Thompson is a professor at Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, more familiarly known as FAMU. She is a faculty member in the Cooperative Extension Program. She received an educational doctorate in interdisciplinary leadership from Creighton University, a master's in education in counselor education from the University of Florida, and a BS in business marketing from FAMU. That sister just has a lot of degrees.
I'm losing. If I were to write it down, I'd get writer's cramp.
Much of Dr. Thompson's responsibilities are in the areas of research-based community education and planning, and leadership and organizational development interwoven with economic development strategies. This work has produced 2 hallmark programs she created: Florida Family Heirs Property Initiative and the Florida Natural and Cultural Resource Placement, which serves as a sustainable wealth-building resource for vulnerable communities, particularly African Americans. So Dr. Thompson, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Welcome.
I'm delighted to be here.
Ray and I recently saw an article that was published in ProPublica that looked at the issue of heirs property. Now, I knew something a little bit about heirs property from a legal conference that I went to several years ago, but I sort of lost touch with the issue. So when we were reading the article, I was like, oh, yes, we should do a show on that. We were so happy to find you. Since this is a big focus of some of your work. So let's just jump right in, and I'm going to ask you, can you explain to our audience what is meant by heirs property, and why is this a problem for Black landowners?
Heirs property is a type of co-tenancy. It's a co-tenancy where most times individuals die without a will, and the state will determine that it's as intestate. And consequently, there is multiple generational transfer of that ownership of the property to the decedent's land. And it's specific to land. For example, say 1862, a gentleman wife bought 50 acres and they died without a will. Here it is, 2021, that land has passed on to the 2021 descendants, however, is divided multiple times. Whereas every decision related to the land must have the agreement of each heir. It is a USDA likened it to a tightly wound knot that's difficult to unwind.
Mm.
So if there were, for example, 4 brothers and the land passed to all 4, and then they had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of those descendants have to agree?
Well, the last tier. So if we're in the 10th generation, the top tier of that 10th generation, those would be the ones with decisional authority.
That could be dozens of people.
50, 60, 70. Yes. In my particular case, it was only 4. But it still was a very costly process. So typically, it's when a person dies without a will, or it can also occur when a person dies with a will, but does not identify who the heirs are, or identify which piece of the property each heir owns.
So if I can ask a quick question, how would a person have a will that doesn't identify who gets what?
Well, that's the issue of estate planning that typically the majority of African Americans do not engage in estate planning. And that goes back to the history, African American history of slavery in this country. And as far back as West Africa. In West Africa, land is viewed as belonging, the people belong to the land, not the land belonging to the people. So consequently here, when the US government after emancipation did not provide the education and technical assistance to teach former enslaved people about the formal property system and surplus value, it kind of fit into their narrative of the land owning them, and that they didn't want to deal with the government. They just wanted to have land that all the family members could come to and lay their head for security. And that worked over time. However, as we merged into the 21st century and there is more regulation, more permitting, it has become a very difficult situation, resulting in most of the land loss that we experienced. In 1910, we had amassed over 15 million acres of land. We've lost over 80% of that. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives attribute that in most cases to heirs property.
So it shouldn't be necessary to say, but I'll just say, if because not all of our listeners are African American, we're talking about Black-owned property, primarily in the South. Now, and I'll just add this piece in from the law side. Now, many times when Black families do get estate planning assistance, the lawyers may not be Black, they may not be culturally competent, and they don't really pay attention to the complexity of Black people's land ownership issues, because they just think, well, it's not that important. So that can happen. But let me just, before we get too far afield, you said in my case, there were only 4 heirs. So what was your case? How did this start for you?
Well, this started in 2010. I was adopted by my paternal grandmother. She and my grandfather were tenant sharecropper farmers on a plantation. And over time, my grandfather passed. They bought, before they passed, they bought 13 acres of land. And at the end, after they had, given out land to the children, when she died in 2010, there were still 4.33 acres in her name. She had a will, and this goes back to the question of the faultiness of will. She had a will, and she listed that the children, including me, I was included because I was legally adopted, needed to divide equally 4.33 heirs. So she didn't specify in the will where our acres were. So the homestead, the other acreage, all were owned by us equally. Now, we all knew that she wanted the homestead to come to me, but that's not what the will said. And so that was what triggered me to decide, if I ever got a doctorate, that my dissertation was going to be on heirs property. 2013, I enrolled at Creighton. 2017, my dissertation was on heirs property. And I have been on that path ever since. Because land that cost us a little bit of money back in 1946 ended up costing us over $10,000 to retain.
Wow.
Just to keep it within the family.
And be able to use it. We could have kept it, but the permitting laws as they exist today would not have allowed us to do any repairs on the house, only if the roof were falling in. But in terms of expanding it, upgrading it, no. If we sold it, we would be basically selling heirs property, and the owners would have the same issues that we would. And that is, heirs property land has a low market value, it's easily stolen, it's easily lost to unpaid taxes. The family conflict that often erupts really predisposes families to be in a constant state of economic vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And that's in contrast to, in this country, the way that wealth is generated is through generational transfer of wealth. But if you can't transfer it in a wealth building state, then you basically have dead capital.
Can you tell us a little bit about the partition aspect of it? So how does that work if you have 20 people who have an interest in the property and someone comes to one of the 20 and says, sell me your share?
That is one of the primary reasons that we lost over 80% of that 15 million acres, because the issue with heirs property is that you mentioned the 4. If anyone in my family, if any one of us had sold our percentage, then that owner, whoever we sold it to, becomes an equal owner, though they still couldn't identify which piece. But typically what happens is, when that happens, there's usually a desire to sell if a family member just wants to sell. But if they sell it to developer, which is most of the time, the developer wants the land for development purposes. Those developers will go to the court and they will say, generally, that the family cannot agree. But we really want this land needs to be sold, and courts traditionally have ruled in favor of economic development over familiar interest. So the end result is a land is usually sold on the courthouse step as a forced partition sale. Oftentimes, family members were not aware that their land was being sold, or even though heirs property has a lower market value than other property, they still could not afford it. So what the Uniform Partitions Heirs Property Act does, it eliminates all of those caveats where basically it gives family members of heirs property due process. They must know about the land and a member's interest in selling it so that they have opportunity to purchase it at a reasonable price so that it can be retained, and that the courts give leeway to give them time to work out what they need in order to get this land. Additional piece that relates to Black farmers is that one of the things with heirs property, because there's not a clear title, it is no longer accepted as collateral. Also, the U.S. government and all of their programs, USDA particularly, have not accepted heirs property as a legitimate way of participating in their loan and grant programs. So what the UPA has done, in 2018 in the Farm Bill, they determined that states that adopted the Uniform Partitions Heirs Property Act would be given, the farmers in there, they would be given access to loans that would allow landowners to clear title to their property.
So if I was a farmer and I am involved in heirs property with my brothers, let's say I have 4 brothers, and I have, let's say, 15 acres of land, I could not use that those acres as collateral to get a loan so that I can buy my farming equipment, fertilizer, seed, whatever. That property would not be of any value to the government.
If it's owned by all 4 of you, no, you could not. Now, there is a caveat where if the 4 brothers entered into a legal agreement giving permission for you to do such, then yes.
And then who would decide how much value the land has?
Well, definitely the farmers would not. One of the things is that, in the US, the formal property system in Florida is called the Property Appraiser's Office. That's where land really goes under this valuation process. And then anyone can go in and look and see what the ownership is. And then typically if it's heirs property, it's not going to be valued as high as non-heirs property. Additionally, timber companies love to, lease land, and they can, grow timber on the land. However, they have pretty much stopped leasing land that's heirs property because there can always be someone to appear in the family to say, well, I didn't know about this. I didn't agree to this. So it presents problems.
So you mentioned the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act. This is the thing that I was exposed to some years ago at a conference. And it was a model law, meaning it was developed and it was suggested that states adopt this model law within their own state system of legislation. But not all states did that, right? So can you tell us a little bit about which states have not adopted the Uniform Partition of Heirs Property Act?
Oklahoma, Louisiana, Tennessee, North Carolina, West Virginia.
Most of those states I try to avoid.
Kentucky in Indiana, Massachusetts, New Jersey, it's been introduced, but it has not passed. One of the things that has helped the momentum toward adopting it is that some of the Western states have viewed for, big farming entities that in many cases aren't Black, they still have these generational farms and they want to secure them so that they pass down in the right way. Some of those states have advocated and supported Uniform Partitions Heirs Property Act. So it's given quite a bit of movement toward other states adopting it.
Would it be fair to say that many of the slave-owning states, many of the states that were formerly slave-owning states have not adopted the act?
I would have said that 2 years ago, but now we have New Mexico, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, which is major for Florida to adopt, South Carolina, Arkansas, Missouri, Virginia in the South. Now, I did miss one. Did I miss Louisiana? Louisiana has not adopted it, and they don't even have anything in the legislature at this point.
So it's pretty interesting because some of the pieces in the article talked specifically about coastal property and how developers are anxious to get their hands on heirs property because, they're attractive for resort purposes. And these families where the land has been in their family for decades can't even go on their own property, which was just stunning.
Hilton Head is a perfect example.
Hilton Head was heirs property?
Yes. Black owned.
And the funny thing, I have people on my father's side of the family that are from that part of South Carolina, and they lost a lot of property back in I want to say when my grandparents were talking to me about this, it was back in the 40s or 50s that they lost a lot of their land, and no one has any proof. All they can just go by is what those developers said. I mean, let's just face it. I mean, land developers, they don't have to tell us what the law says. They just have to tell us. Yeah.
Which is why this particular podcast is so wonderful, because it introduces the topic. I would I know at least 90% of African-American people, regardless of where they live, if they have roots in the South, were owners of heirs property. Because you remember the Great Migration. Mm-hmm. As they moved west, north, east, the laws about property ownership didn't change. They still own part of the land that's here. Unfortunately, sometimes when they find out about it, they feel that they have no connection to the land, never been on the land, so let's sell it. And I think one of the next phases in this process is educating people of color about land being the foundation of the economic system that runs the United States of America. So when you give away land or you don't replace it, then you're giving away any capacity to truly participate in intergenerational transfer of wealth.
That's just fascinating. I know that there is some movement for people to return to the South. I'm not talking about the Charles Blow. Let's go help the Black people in the South because there's not enough of them. I'm not talking about that argument, which I think is just ridiculous. But I know that there are small groups of Black people who are going to the South and purchasing land where they can to try to reestablish Black land ownership in the South. But you make a good point that many of us who have roots in the South may not know what our relatives are experiencing on the heirs property issue because we don't live there and we're not in constant contact with our relatives. I was in my 30s before I even knew I had roots in the South because my parents and my grandparents never talked about it. They just didn't want to talk about it. So I found out that my grandmother was from Alabama when I read her obituary, her funeral program, because she never talked about that with us.
We're of that generation where children were to be seen and not heard.
Yes, but still, even as adults, my father was born in Brooklyn, never went to the South.
Mm-hmm.
He's not one of those kids that got sent down South during the summer. So he couldn't tell us about going down South for the summer because he never went there. My grandparents didn't want him there. So it's interesting what you say about educating the community on that. And Ray, we'll have to do some thinking about that to see how we can.
Yeah. I mean, let's face it. I mean, because of lynchings and burnings and things like that, folks people stayed away. I mean, they left for a reason, and a lot of them just didn't want to go back for fear.
Yeah.
So isn't that interesting? The multiple oppression that occurred when you think about the statement that you made. Number one, you're treated bad anyway. There's a threat of death. But what's happening too, you're being run off the very thing that gives you the capacity to compete. The profound horror of the experience that Black people or anyone, but we're talking about Black people right now, have with wealth building is that when they and their parents and grandparents felt that they would have a better chance of physical and financial survival up north or northeast or northwest, it had a triple impact on Black people generally to be participants in wealth building in this country because they disconnected from the land. And a majority, I'm not going to say I'm uneducated because I was left in the South, but there is, we usually it was the grandparents left on the land trying to do the best that they could. And over time, as they educated the ones who were left, they stayed on it. The ones up north and other places are having a difficult time seeing the value of the land. But essentially, what I try to say to everyone, if you go back and look at white economic positioning, it has to do with private property ownership that engaged estate planning. If you're disconnected from the land, you're not able to provide the information to your family members that helps them engage in estate planning so that the land grows and it continues to build up the family. For example, if you're going to sell land, this is what I tell people. Okay, are you going to buy something else? Are you going to buy more land? If you're not going to sell it, are you going to engage in voluntary partitioning, which is what my family did? Or are you going to look at an LLC or a trust to merge those divided titles under one, so then you eliminate the heirs property issue from a financial perspective? Then you can do economic development with the government. You can get using land as collateral. You can also decide, depending on their acreage, we're going to use some of it for economic development, maybe build a residential development as a family. The other will keep open for family members to live on. Or we may decide to lease it. So in that way, the wealth continues to build. And every family member associated with it benefits.
You know, it does make sense. And it's interesting because we don't normally think about estate planning for rural people. Just in the law, we just don't do it. It doesn't seem lucrative enough, but we're going to have some shows on estate planning so that our listeners, and who knows, maybe some of our listeners actually are heirs property owners and they don't even know it. So I know that a number of people in the group do have ties to the South, particularly Virginia and Alabama. So
I get calls from all over the state, all over the country.
Yeah. No,
once they do realize.
It's a fascinating subject and something who thinks about that on a regular daily basis. You don't think about it.
Guess who does think about it?
Oh, the white people who want the land.
Well, a lot of our investment companies, they're buying swaths of land in Mississippi and Alabama that was formerly heirs property land.
But I have a question, Professor Thompson, regarding the opportunity for shady lawyers, politicians, people like that to basically cheat folks out of their land. Is there a way to even quantify how much property has been lost because of those shady dealings?
Well, as I mentioned, the Federation of Southern Cooperatives and Land Trust estimates we've lost 80% of the land that we'd accumulated by the year 1910. And most of that is due to heirs property, which then a large percentage of that is based on forced partition sales. So in this process of selling the land on the courthouse steps, historically, judges, lawyers, bankers have colluded. I'm not saying all, but it's been documented. The AP did a wonderful story on that, that they colluded to take the land. It's amazing. And it's horrific. The multiple oppression that Black people have experienced. And I would like to say, there are other groups that own large pieces, a large amount of heirs property, not just Black people. Black people happen to own the most by far. But the Appalachians, that region, Native Americans, as well as Hispanics also deal with the issue. And, so when we talk about equity, inequality, until we deal with the issue of land ownership, you cannot bring about equity without dealing with that when it comes to Black people. A researcher by the name of Weimer noted that in the Black Belt region, which, the Mississippi, Alabama, Louisiana, the top half of Florida, all of the Virginias, all of that, because of the rich soil, that everything has been thrown at dealing with the poverty. The one thing that has not is creating a way that the Black residents could access the wealth of that land. And that's dealing with heirs property. That hasn't been done. Now, why is that? Because it's provided in my book ways for corporate entities to make untold amount of money.
So this has all been fascinating. So let me see if we can kind of wrap it up. What's on the horizon for Black people who have heirs properties issues, or what are you hoping to see developed over the next period of time to help relieve some of this oppression on the people who have heirs property?
Well, one of the things I would like for there to be a greater knowledge that heirs property doesn't just impact farming communities. it's also urban. You may have a father, mother who passed away, professors at universities or in great positions, making significant money. But when they do not address their assets and provide a will such that heirs property is not created, it's created. There are many, many situations like that. There are many, many Black urban communities that, because they have high incidence of heirs property, they're being displaced, moved out because of the heirs property. And these are urban centers. So it's not just a rural thing, but then the last thing is that for every state, every county, every parish, you may find different title clearing regulations. That prevents a barrier. And particularly for more regulated cities and towns, the cost of clearing your title is so cumbersome that families end up choosing not to clear the title. So if it stays in an heirs property status, then you run the risk of predatory developers getting a piece of it. So you're caught.
Yeah.
No matter which way you turn. So I think those two issues, addressing urban heirs property, addressing the cost factors associated with voluntary title clearing at the local level.
Okay. All right. Those are, I have done some closings in my life as a lawyer, and I know that the title clearing issue is monumental. Monumental. So that gives us something to think about. Yeah. So Dr. Thompson, we want to just thank you so much for coming on the show. That's been just eye-opening. And just so you know, we broke our Princeton presenters rule so that you could come on. And I'm so happy that we did, because I've learned so much from you today. And I'm sure that our listeners will have learned as well. And who knows, maybe we're going to have you come back and do some further discussion on the economic equity issue. So thank you so very much for coming on the show.
Thank you all for having me. I've loved it. Great things will come from this engagement.
And Michelle, on our next podcast, we're looking to discuss some of the recent deaths of professional football players, one of which was Vincent Jackson, who was a wide receiver for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And he was found in his car by himself, and his family said he had been suffering from alcoholism and lingering effects of concussions and what have you. So we're going to take a moment and have a conversation with Doctors Herman Taylor and Ross Zafanti, who are part of the football players' health study at Harvard University, to talk about some of the health issues that professional football players, after they retire, suffer through.
If you enjoyed what you heard today, visit our website, NubianTigersPodcast.com. In addition to the podcast, we also post a resource page for each subject to provide additional sources of information. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @NubianTigers, written as one word. We're on YouTube on the Nubian Tigers podcast channel. Have a favorite podcast service? Well, we're probably on it, so just subscribe and look for us under Nubian Tigers Talk. Looking forward to sharing some knowledge with you next time.
Wake up, wake up, wake up.